So warm welcome as usual to our extraordinary meetup. So we have Chris Feeney today, which is showing us great things in our Imprivata development, but also in our alignment with the solution itself. There is a new feature which is coming soonish, I would call it this way, which was asked for more than a decade regarding Imprivata. But before going too deep into that, let me just share one thing. So we have a meetup planned together with Vasion Printer Logic on the 12th of October. So if you didn't register until now, which you couldn't because it was released only today, do me a favor, look at this, because this will be a great session where Vasion will show a deep dive in the solution, how to install, but also how to debug all his ecosystem. So we will have more or less 1 hour talking about a new not a new technology, but a technology partner, which is now re-entering the IGEL community. So we will also have a relaunch of their technology partner Slack channel. Be prepared on the next official meetup. We'll share a little bit more about that. And that's all from my end. I would now shut up and turn it over to Chris.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Seb and Renee, for having me. I'm looking forward to getting a little bit more deep into this topic. I know it's been kind of out there. People have kind of seen it, wasn't sure what it's about. And today we're going to dig into it a little bit more deeply. So let me go ahead and get the Zoom so I can share my screen, and then we'll get into it right away. If you have questions from a logistics perspective, please put them into either the chat. Actually, there should be a Q&A, so that's probably better if we just use the Q&A option, which you should have access to.
And we will monitor it for you, Chris. So focus on your presentation.
Yeah.
Renee and I will have a look on the Q&A.
Great. So you should be looking at my first slide here. Make sure everybody's seeing that.
Yep, in there.
Perfect. So if I had one slide to kind of tell the story, it would start with probably this one here. Visually, obviously it's about tap and go experience. We've been doing that with Imprivata for a number of years. And that has really kind of resided on what Imprivata has been able to support. Because it's their agent that is getting installed on IGEL from their appliance, and they update that with new feature functionality along the way, which would include what they support for accessing the traditional virtual environments where applications or desktops are being consumed for users. And when I came to IGEL, that included basically that was 5 years ago. So they had Microsoft RDP stuff with local on-prem kind of resources, VMware, just desktops in terms of the Imprivata Linux agent, no Horizon apps, for example, and then apps and desktops for Citrix. In fact, my second week on the job here at IGEL was at Citrix Synergy in Anaheim, and they had just released, or shortly there before, the published application workflow for Pi, and so we had set that up and we're demoing that. And there are some nuances to getting all that correctly set up. But what began to emerge were some additional challenges here. I mean, I'll get into some of that, but this is sort of what sort of drove this project. Obviously Imprivata is widely deployed in the healthcare sector, and IGEL was growing in that sector, certainly here in North America, but certainly overseas as well, for various reasons. I mean, everybody loves IGEL for a lot of different reasons, and saving money by repurposing devices, some of the net new opportunities emerging with vendors like HP, Lenovo, LG, and others. And all this happening over the course of the last few years, and of course we had a pandemic kind of pushing people to consume resources from the cloud, which introduced other scenarios where if you look at where's the money being spent, what options do we have, and then vendors being able to start to allow for or move their products into a cloud scenario. Obviously, you have vendors like Citrix or VMware or Microsoft certainly giving you access to cloud resources. So all these things kind of building up to a need where, from an IGEL perspective, a few years ago, we were the first Linux vendor on stage when they launched what was at the time WVD. And so we were kind of ahead of the game there. Didn't really see that in terms of customers, in terms of healthcare customers, Imprivata more specifically, looking to go to WVD right away. What we began to see is certain parts of the world where they were ready to make that jump sooner than others, usually those early adopters. They liked IGEL. They liked being able to repurpose devices. They had Imprivata, tap and go. Can we use that to get to, for example, AVD? So we began to look into that. And that ensued conversations, obviously, internally as well as with Imprivata. The long and short of it is a project like this, building your own agent, you can't do that unless you have an agreement in place with Imprivata to do that. And so we had to work through some of the specifics, which I'll kind of talk to. But our larger vision here was, if IGEL's on that endpoint, we wanted to be able to address key use cases that were emerging. And often it's, from my perspective, from the years I was in the field and helping customers implement tap and go or different sort of scenarios, you have to be able to figure out the shared workstation, which consists of several things. And then this is the most complex scenario to try to address because you have people coming and going, you have direct patient care involved many times, you have to get it right. I've told this story before that if you look at the in-room workstation scenario, several years ago, I was still, maybe last year at Imprivata, whatever, my dad had an accident and was in the ICU, and I went down to see him, and I'm in the room, and it was during the night, and I'm just kind of, trying to rest, and I see the nurse come in, and she goes to tap her badge on one of those, devices that you see there, and she didn't get logged into Epic. They were using Epic, and I knew immediately what had happened, and I was able to just kind of, hey, do this, and I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can somebody please mute themselves? Thank you. But just it alarmed me. I mean, it was a simple thing, and we got it resolved. But it just reminded me of the fact that I mean, for me, it was my dad, like to the left there by 2-3 feet, and there's the nurse, and he's in the ICU, and he's under sedation and everything, and his life wasn't at risk in terms of that particular situation, but it's still, at the end of the day, it has to work. And so getting that right is one of the key challenges. And certainly Imprivata's learned a lot of lessons along the way, trying to get their Windows agent, certainly get their Linux agent, and just getting that whole use case and workflow. And so taking on a project like this, I had that in mind in terms of, what are we going to try to address with if we go this route. And so in the shared workstation, that can be something as, we'll talk about this later. User walks up, taps their badge. What happens after that? Getting the user to a shared resource, a virtual desktop, is generally one of the more common scenarios, not always, but usually a simple, I'll call it a simple use case. Tap in, here's my virtual desktop, I do my thing, I tap out and disconnect it, and then that roams around with me. Where it gets a little bit more complex is if you have to share that resource and you're not roaming it around, that's a little more complex. There's a lot going on behind the scenes to make something like that work. But IGEL was growing in popularity in these sort of scenarios, and so we wanted to be able to address the fact that if they were using Imprivata on these devices and had a use case, just by switching from maybe Windows or some other thin client vendor perhaps to IGEL, could we have the same use case supported? Or is it something that we would want to add later on? And obviously you can see with things that are very popular, dictation microphones are very key in the electronic medical world because it's a lot easier to dictate than type medical terms and that type of thing inside the patient record. And so other use cases where IGEL is, being used would be the back office scenarios, right? We probably talked about this on prior community things, all the Zoom and Teams optimization and Cisco Web, all that stuff, it can still be used in the telehealth virtual visit scenario. And obviously during the pandemic, that was a very highly popular thing. And IGEL's done a ton with the unified comms to support that type of scenario, offloading the audio and video down. And so we have cool vendors and stories where, if you look at that size monitor, it might have a built-in webcam that pops up or down or whatever it might be. And they're able to do that in a setting where it's quiet. You can talk to the patient and kind of do that type of healthcare. And it may not be a shared workstation, people coming and going very quickly, but still, do you need Windows on that endpoint to be able to do something like that? Very often, you don't necessarily need that. So these are sort of the larger things. And then other use cases that are very popular, the work from home situation. That may not be a tap and go situation, but you're still getting into resources on-prem or remote, whatever. IGEL has obviously a good situation there with either the UD Pocket, if it's a BYOD scenario. Call centers, I'm using an EPOS headset. I love this device. I use it all the time. And obviously that can be a great scenario where IGEL in a healthcare setting or not is being used to handle customer service, what it might be, registration, who knows what. And so it's not always necessarily about tap and go. And we'll talk a lot about that, but there are other scenarios that I just want to make sure that, we certainly let you know, like, hey, this one on the bottom right, it's not a very complex scenario, but it's very popular. If you can see here, you got the nurses looking at it. Often what that is that in that particular ward or wing of the hospital, there's a number of patients and rooms, and that status board kind of gives an idea of what's going on. And sometimes it might be touchscreen or not. Just that the status gets updated as something changes. Maybe the room is the patient is discharged and they clean the room and make it available for somebody else. But something like that is that. And also some other ones on the bottom left with touchscreen registration, automation kind of things, not necessarily using badge and tap and go, but still in a situation where IGEL could be used. So let's kind of talk through obviously what we've done right with this project, and I'll get into the expansion of our partnership. Obviously, for those that are familiar with Imprivata, they have been doing this for a long time. They're IGEL actually from a age of our company, we're about the same age. I think we're just a year older, 22, 3 years old as a company, and Imprivata's not far behind that. And so similar, we have similar scenarios where their appliance is a hardened Linux device, very similar to our operating system, a hardened Linux OS for the endpoint. And obviously security in mind, and then obviously driving into what happens after that. And so what emerged obviously is a lot of this authentication, which is a time savings, security play, but net new opportunities. And so I'm going to talk a lot about the Azure cloud situation where we're starting to see that, but also kind of talk through some of the other scenarios that we've tried to address with this project. So what happened is in 2022, we embarked after over a decade of working together to expand the partnership with the focus effort on what we began to see in our customer base, not just healthcare, but other industries too, interestingly enough. Maybe less complex situations, but just as important. And a lot of that had to do with the emergence of Microsoft into the world with what they've offering up with now Windows 365 and also AVD, formerly WVD. But along the way, there were some other use cases that our customers were asking for with Citrix and VMware. So a lot of that was in a specific location. I wanted to be able to kind of enhance the Imprivata policy, right? So for example, this emerged in one of the customers. I want to say it must have been around the pandemic. They had a work from home desktop and a clinical desktop, and they were using Teradici devices. And Teradici was like the very first Prove-ID embedded or a Prove-ID web vendor that Imprivata ever integrated with. And they had the ability just to, hey, when I log in, launch this resource. With Imprivata, they have a policy where if you got more than one resource, it's going to ask you to, hey, pick one, please. So they started testing IGEL, which means they were using Pi, and they were seeing this prompt. They're like, hey, we're not seeing that with our old devices, which you can't convert because it's Teradici. You need to look at some other device. Is there something that can be done for that? Times that experience by a number of customers, similar kind of thing. They begin to look at IGEL for the first time. They're in Imprivata. They bring in the Pi agent, and then they notice some of the behavior that the Pi agent offers based on the user policy settings. Could we do something to try to bypass that? I'll use that word. And so we looked at that, and we did actually develop a feature around doing that. But the number one thing is really the bottom piece. From our perspective, the appliance mode, I'm going to assume most people know what that is. It was a restrictive situation. All the stuff that people love about IGEL, the desktop access, the tools and other things that you may need, or the ability to lock that down, or get to that, or bring up something. When you're in appliance mode, it's super restrictive, and you got to do some stuff that to make other tools available, but it may not always be user friendly or administrator friendly, whatever it might be. And there's been some stuff along the way to make some of those tools available. But we wanted to have a solution that would allow access to the local desktop and also provide a similar experience if they're using Pi. So that was kind of a driving it. And so other factors, I'll just kind of put this up here briefly and then talk about what we've done. And so there are other scenarios where maybe they're not ready to embrace the cloud, but they do like the option of having a disaster recovery situation just in case. And we have seen situations where, ransomware has hit the location and it's spreading, and they need to do something quickly. The UD Pocket is a way to often bypass if the machines are getting infected or whatever. We have had customers where they were deploying IGEL, they still had Windows. The IGEL devices did not get impacted, whereas their Windows ones were completely compromised. They had to re-image them. Or we had some customers where they were throwing UD Pockets into devices proactive or preventively, trying to get those machines at least secured before they can completely contain the attack. Anyway, so lots of things kind of happening out there in the world, and we wanted to be able to have a solution that could address different scenarios. And so what we've done here is complementary, right? We wanted to have and it's not like we're completely abandoning what's on the left, the Imprivata built agent. That definitely has some scenarios there that are totally fine, and but it was more being able to build for these other scenarios that were emerging that have begun to become more popular as customers are looking at. But so one of the things was AVD Cloud PC support. That's beginning to emerge more and more. But on the right side, what also happened with IGEL is we introduced a new version, you might have heard of it, called Cosmos. And that completely changed sort of how things work. We have this app portal. So Imprivata wasn't ready to build an app for the portal yet. That really became to light really at the beginning of this year. And so we had already been building the agent in version 11. And so we began to focus on, in parallel, a version 12 of the app, which from a code perspective, we didn't want to have, complete disparity between version 11. So the agent code is basically the same. We add new features and functionality, check that or whatever it might be, fixes, and then make sure we, port that back into a version 11. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. And the non-appliance mode experience gives us that flexibility to be able to control a little bit more what the user experience might be, and also allow for that IGEL desktop access, which, generally speaking, the normal user may not necessarily need it, but if the help desk or somebody needs it to get to tools or whatever it might be, the ability is there, whereas in appliance mode, you don't have that option. Common things might be sound preferences, for example, or there's a multi-monitor request. If I want to have a user customize what that is, and we've been working through some of that. And then other things. Now, one of the things I'll talk about from a license perspective is it is a Workspace Edition add-on license. It is required. That turns the feature on, but the use case has to be validated first. And the reason is because we haven't built a Swiss Army knife to address every possible problem you may encounter in the world. We have addressed certain scenarios, and I'll talk about what those are. And then we have stuff on our roadmap. So if your scenario is such that it meets that requirement or whatever, and then yes, yeah. Then otherwise, if you're just interested in it because it sounds cool, but you don't actually have a use case that is currently supported, probably not one where it really makes sense. But we also are beginning to see additional use cases that are showing up, and if it's coming up pretty common, usually if you're in a product management world, development, it's 3 people like, oh, that's interesting. 3 times this week, people have asked about that, and then you get to the point where you have 10. It becomes more of a trend, and you're kind of monitoring for that, and that usually drives priority of addressing that, or at least getting customer feedback as to the scenario that they're trying to address. And we've actually had some pretty cool ones that have emerged out of that. So some of the key differences, and then I'll get into the specifics here. So what we've built is primarily 2 use case workflows. On the left side, we call it auth only or authentication only. The agent uses the appliance as an IDP. User authenticates, we check various things, policy, we check licensing and all that stuff. And then we get their credentials, and then we refer to a local or pre-configured session. And then we take those credentials that we receive back from the appliance. All of that is done securely. And then we essentially proxy those credentials into a locally pre-configured session. So this is a scenario where you can't do multiple types of sessions. It's at the same time, it's just one. So I've got one here, I'll show you here. I've got my Microsoft AVD one set up, and then I can move it over to VMware or Citrix. And this allows for some customization. For example, if it's Citrix, customers may like the ability to control, like, hey, I want to be able to see icons on the desktop after I log the user in. I don't necessarily get that experience with Pi, but that type of thing. And so, but it also has allowed for AVD has remote apps. That's an emerging thing. VMware has Horizon apps, and because we're using the native Horizon client, for example, or the user gets authenticated into that, and then they get the normal chooser that comes with it. So we're just sort of providing that tap and go experience into those apps that are either embedded into the firmware with IGEL OS 11 or the app that comes from version 12 in the portal. On the right side, this is where the agent behaves like Pi, in the sense that we're not authenticating the user into a locally pre-configured session. The main key difference here is that we have the ability to select to launch a pre-selected resource based on location, for example. So the user, this is the scenario where the Pi agent might prompt the user if they have more than one desktop resource, for example. And they don't like that. They want to be able to say, hey, when I tap in, I want to launch this desktop or this app or whatever it might be from a Citrix perspective. And you have the ability to kind of do that. That's the main scenario there. And then I mentioned some of the experimental things. We had some fast user switching code with Citrix on the Pi side, and so we added that into the agent, and we're testing still kind of some scenarios there where customers they have the non-appliance mode situation, so you can see the IGEL desktop, and our agent is able to bring up a desktop, for example, or an app. In this case, Epic is very popular. And then you can do a fast user switching experience. We still have some things there in terms of we don't have a ton of customers that were requesting that, but at least in the early access program, but it is something that has emerged more frequently. So and this is not uncommon, right? If you look at IGEL's release notes, right? Maybe Citrix comes out with a new workspace app feature, that we call experimental, and at some point it moves from that to just generally available or whatever after more testing or feedback has come about. All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about this, and then I'm going to get into some of the demo itself. Since I mentioned earlier the auth only, these are the current supported and approved use case, and this will change over time as we take something off experimental or add feature support or something else comes available on the market. So on the left side is OS 11, on the right side is OS 12. So this is why the use case has to be validated, because again, doesn't cover everything. We want to make sure that if you do have one of these use cases on the left or right, whatever, we have, baseline profiles to work from, basically your template to use, and then you just punch in your specifics. Where's my appliance? Where's my certs? That type of thing. Being able to tap in, get to a Microsoft AVD roaming desktop. We have one customer testing remote apps right now. It's actually going pretty well, but we're not declaring official support because it's just, you can't do that with one customer. You got to have like 20 or so, or at least more to choose from. But it is something that is, leveraging the ability to talk to the appliance, log into the Microsoft AVD client that we've built, and then the user gets a list of resources, which could be, hey, here's what you have available to, or you just say, hey, launch this resource all the time. And Windows Cloud PC using our AVD app, and then Citrix Workspace app, apps or desktops, Horizon desktops, RDSH apps. I've got it as experimental, mainly because we, again, don't have a ton of customers using that, but it is, generally speaking, working, and we have a profile to work from. And that's something that, for example, the Pi agent doesn't support RDSH apps for Horizon right now. I don't know if Imprivata will add that to their roadmap, but we had a few customers where that was what they were looking for. So on the right side, we tried as best as possible to try to map to the same scenarios, but there were some differences. You've got a new OS, and you have apps, and the way they work together is maybe in some cases slightly different. And so that's, for example, why Citrix is not yet there. We're working through some changes in terms of how the Citrix integration works. I think that's it should be coming soon, but if you are looking at 12 and you are a Citrix scenario, that's more of a wait until we have it. But you could certainly do some stuff with Citrix with OS 11. The license will work with either one. It's not like a different license, based on that. It's really the same. And then these are the follow Imprivata policies workflow. So as I mentioned, sort of that key feature, that location override primary feature there. So with Citrix, it's really looking again what Imprivata VDA policies are in terms of you go into the appliance and you so it's sort of looking at that. And then with Citrix, it's apps or desktops. With Horizon, it's primarily desktops, and Microsoft, again, not a ton of customers with RDP. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this experimental fast user switching stuff, which we'll have more on that in the coming months. And then on the right side, there is, again, what's different is on OS 11, everything's sort of included in that firmware. On the right side, you're going to have the base version of the OS, and we've got 12.02 that just came out, for example. So at some point, we'll change that base version. And then with VMware right now, it's just the, in terms of follow policies workflow, it's just a Horizon app at the moment. And then we'll add these other things as far as app dependencies go. So that's a real brief overview. Let me bring up, give me a second. I just want to touch on some of these requirements. So on the UMS side, right, this is one of these checkboxes, assuming your use case is approved. Knowing customers may not be ready to go to UMS 12 yet. You'd have to be at least at 610, 140 or 150 as a private build that you can access. And if you're already on UMS 12, no problem, you're good to go. On the licensing piece, you have to have Workspace Edition or the EMP subscription, WE or the Cosmos Pass, but primarily that Workspace Edition. And then the add-on license attaches to that. So it has to be under active maintenance, essentially. On the right side, those are the versions of firmware that are available for version 11 when they were released. And then we've got 11.09 coming out here in just over a week or so. And then a version 12 is available, as I mentioned, with what it supports at the moment. There are some Imprivata requirements. Let's talk about those. Obviously, when you're coding to that appliance, and there's different versions, you're probably familiar with Imprivata's G3 or G4 designation for their appliances, and then what versions are supported on those appliances. If you're a G3 shop, technically speaking, we started working with this at 7.2, but Imprivata doesn't support anything lower than 7.6 at the moment. So 7.6 to 7.10 on the G3, and G4 is 7.10 and higher. They've changed their designation now, like 23 something or other. It's like 1, 2, or 3, whatever. But going forward, you do have to have the authentication management, as I mentioned over here, single sign-on licensing, and then this virtual desktop access. We are required to check for those things, for example, and then this allowing the full API access here, as you see in this screenshot. And IGEL OS is an option that has to be selected for obvious reasons. And then on the Microsoft AVD side, since this is somewhat newer, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this. So in order to get you into the AVD app, we have to get the UPN, which is the email address essentially, from the appliance. And so we can do that in a couple ways. We initially do that with a single sign-on profile. We have that. It's basically it's something we provide. You upload it to the appliance, and you deploy it, and then that gives us UPN. And then we have the password, and we use that to log into the AVD IGEL app. And then if you then want to have the Imprivata agent, the Windows agent in that AVD or cloud PC, if it's multi-session AVD, you have to have the Imprivata, what's called the Type 3 agent, which is their Citrix terminal server agent for multi-session type platforms. If it's a cloud PC, that would be generally a single user machine. That's what they call their Type 1 agent. So those are the two differences. And the devices, the machines need to be hybrid joined. And the main reason is it's about the identity, right? The Imprivata agent is, or the appliance is syncing with your, right now, and in the current versions, your on-prem legacy AD, I'll just call it that, which is, generally speaking, synced up with the Azure AD Connect, for example. And so when you're authenticating the user, they're enrolling their card or they're logging in with their on-prem domain account. And then we get the email address and everything to log you into that cloud resource and take them there. So, all right, enough slides. Let me stop sharing, and then I'm gonna bring up my demo environment here. Make sure we're good to go. Let me start sharing again.
By the way, you didn't miss questions in the Q&A. We just had a couple of discussions in the chat, but nothing you need to take care of. Really good presentation until now, Chris. Really interesting.
Great. Okay, yeah, I'll definitely come back to that in a second. So let me do the demo piece. All right, let me share my screen.
We just made a joke before having Chris starting that a live demo, a working live demo cannot be real. So let's see what happens now.
Very good. Hey, come on, man. All right, so this is visually, this is my laptop here, and I've got it set up. We wanted it to look, if you're familiar with the Pi agent, from a design perspective, we started working on the login screen, the full one, around January, February-ish, and got some feedback on it. We wanted it to obviously reflect some key design features if a customer had both in place, Pi and also the new agent. And so what's really cool, and this is other things we're working through, is I can toggle down to the a smaller screen, still functional, but there's the IGEL local desktop that you don't have when you're in the appliance mode that's restricted, right? And so obviously at this point, you control what's from a UMS administrator perspective, you control what the user can see. For me, I don't like putting icons on the desktop. It just is gives the user something to click on, or if they don't need to. And so, but you could control that or make it available in a DR situation or whatever. But we've got some things like I'll just kind of highlight this, right? If I need to quickly restart the agent, if it's a Pi, it's more difficult. It's usually you're rebooting that machine. With this agent, we don't necessarily have to do that. And so it's a quick restart. There you go. And I've returned back to my state. And so just something simple. Other things we've done is put some controls here on the menu, shutdown, reboot. And then obviously what's going to happen here, I'll tap my user's badge in here. And I'm already within what's called my grace period. So I didn't get asked for my second factor. So that has already occurred. I think I've got maybe a 4-hour window on it, whatever it might be, based on Imprivata policy. And so here's my Azure virtual desktop that I've authenticated into. And some things that we've started to see, if you're familiar with Azure Stack HCI, where customers can buy infrastructure and actually have something like an AVD session actually coming local from their data center versus actually the cloud data center. That's a new functionality that Microsoft has allowed for license-wise and whatever. And so that basically means you're getting into that multi-session resource much more quickly. That option, from my understanding, for Cloud PC doesn't exist. Cloud PC is all DAS from the sky, but AVD is certainly there. Now this is a Windows 11 multi-session, just so you can see. Here's the Imprivata agent in the corner here, and so I've got applications. This is where the Imprivata single sign-on occurs, and I can, if I just tap out here, what we're doing behind the scenes is quickly disconnecting that desktop. So you can see here, it's already been disconnected behind the scenes. And then let me see if my log was running. Here we go. I'll just kind of, if we're going to get geeky here for a minute. So the log file is in var log user, and I'm tailing it so you can see sort of some communication chatter here going on. That's available, and this can be exported off the machine if there's any thing that needs to be submitted or reviewed, for example. And so, this chatter here is actually virtual channel chatter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Why is that important? If you know anything about Imprivata, one of the things that they offer up is when you're inside an application, there may be times, especially in healthcare, where you need to do additional order signing, and using the Imprivata authentication readers that might be in use. And they use this virtual channel component, which means you're not having to USB redirect a device into the virtual resource to do that. And so we have added support for that in the agent based on our agreement with Imprivata. I'm going to show you what's behind the scenes here, and then we'll take some questions here. So the the agent lives here. And you can see I've got a profile that sort of locked it down, and it's an on-off switch. Where's my appliance, or appliances, I should say, because if you can do multiple appliances, just specify semicolon here. So if you're, you got 2 in test, and then you got 4 in production, you just specify them semicolon, lay them all out FQDN wise. Your certificates, just put them all here. Just deploy them as common cert from UMS or as SSL cert. Common usually covers all your bases, and just put them in that directory like they would normally would. They're going to be there anyway. And then as long as we've got the certs there, we don't have to go specifically to a cert. Now, some things we've seen, if you have replaced the self-signed cert on the Imprivata appliance with one that's signed by an external CA, make sure you have the root and intermediates in that directory, the certs that sign the appliance certs. Those are going to be needed. And then that'll allow the communication to successfully occur when our agent goes to talk to the appliance. And then the rest of this is this use case. I've got it set up for the auth only workflow. So that means this follow Imprivata policies option is disabled, and I'm doing this auth only pre-configured session option. And then I specify what the name of that session is, and then we get credentials and we stuff them into that pre-configured session. So at a minimum, you would have this enabled in your profile, and then you would have the session here, ABD enabled. So you can see this is the name of the session. And then you've got other settings. So for me, like I don't put the desktop icon out there, whatever. And then specifically for logon, we're providing the username and the password that we get from the appliance. If the user has more than one resource, as you saw in my case, I just have that Windows 11 desktop. But if they have more than one, this is where you could allow for, hey, launch the Windows 11 AVD session or whatever you call it, and just specify it there. So that's kind of cool. If they have multiple resources and you don't do that, then what happens after they log in is they'll get the IGEL AVD chooser. Here's your list of resources, for example, or you'll get reconnected to one that you've already that's already disconnected and you're just reconnecting to it. So some flexibility there. The rest of this is really optional. It has nothing to do with tap and go. It's just, hey, for me, I'm going to need Zoom VDI plugin or whatever it might be, that type of thing. Or I've got some printing stuff that I'm using. So all of that is unrelated to the tap and go, but still available. Other things from a customization, you probably saw I had that custom wallpaper. And so we have some options there. Forgive me, I'm going to go to the registry now and I'll show you where that is. All right. All things live in the registry at some point before it shows up in the UI. So for us, it's in the system registry IIA, and I'll walk through some of this. So these are more default settings. The background image, right? So we can either choose to get one from the appliance, or I can put down into the WFS directory different images, wallpapers or whatever. And you can see here I've specified this one, this JPEG file. So from a UMS, I've gone in and deployed files, into that directory, and they're here. Like here's different images. So it's kind of a cool customization. What I like to do is, and I'll show this to you in a second, I'll drag this device into a different directory. It's going to assume a new config, and the wallpaper immediately tells me what use case I've got, for example. A couple things here I'll talk about. Here's the appliance, the server. This is where my appliances are. And then people have to, like, hey, we have to be able to fail over to an appliance if that exists. We have a default of five seconds. We can lower that or increase it depending on what you want to do. But that's where you would do that. Per customer requests, this is actually a setting that Pi has. If you have more than one appliance, more than one domain imported into the Imprivata appliance, the agent would have a list of what those are in alphabetical order. If you don't want that, you want the user to see a specific domain, then you would just specify it here, and the agent would show that to you. And I'll show you that in a second here. Other things we can control after the user taps out. Do you want it to disconnect the session or log off? And so I've got it set to disconnect that session. If I log off, that's where it's logging out of the session itself. If I'm doing the follow VDI, it's same thing, right? So we saw this with the Citrix scenario where we were tapping out, and it was, instead of disconnecting the session, it started logging off. We're like, what's going on there? And we looked at the code and we're like, okay, let's fix that. So this is now a choosable option here into the registry. And oftentimes, I mean, usually you're going to disconnect the resource, generally speaking, if you're doing like a roaming workflow. And then this is more, this is interesting. So there are certain devices out there, UD3s, UD7s, that had an embedded smart card reader, like the HID OmniKey one. which when our agent looks at that, it's on there, it actually sees it as a prox reader. But we have a feature where you just ignore that instead. And I've got a UD7 here where I can show you. Basically, you run a command to see what it is, and you just copy it in there. And why is that important? Well, if you don't actually have a Imprivata badge reader plugged in, and the user is seeing a badge reader to tap into, and it's not actually there, they're probably going to call the help desk. So by ignoring that, you can basically display what's available. So if I go back to my shadow session, for example, I'll just close the log out. All right, let me go to the full screen here. All right, watch what happens when I unplug my prox reader. Live demo. Oh, you know what? I know why. The feature I just talked about, this is from my UD7. Oh, I'm sorry, I grabbed the wrong. So my bad. This laptop is an embedded prox reader in it. So I can't physically unplug the reader. Over here on my UD7, which is not on the Zoom call or being shadowed, I have that embedded smart card reader, and I unplugged, and I'm telling it to ignore it so the user doesn't see an opportunity to tap their badge in, because there is no, I mean, with a smart card reader, you got to insert the card. So I just plugged it back in. My apologies, I forgot to do that, but that's kind of one of those scenarios that we ran into. That would be, hey, we probably want to make sure that we ignore that reader if somebody's going to be using those devices. So let's pause. We've got a few minutes. I'm going to take some questions here. Let me stop sharing, and then let's see what we've got here. I guess I'll start with the chat. Is there anything in the chat? I see John.
There's one question from John, yeah.
All right, let's take a look here, John. Great question. So from an IGEL perspective, it was an opportunity to work with Imprivata, obviously to somewhat convince them, but also recognize that there's opportunity here to work closer together for the betterment of our customers. And as you know, Imprivata has grown to multiple types of products. And so one of the things that continued to emerge was the fact that our focus on software, the OS, gave us the ability to rapidly address things. So that also was in our favor. As far as building other third-party agents like this, to be determined, we certainly, there are other vendors out there, but there's nothing being coded right now from an IGEL perspective. The focus of here was obviously to address the more common scenarios that we have with Imprivata accounts. Let's see here. Let's see, scrolling down. So that's it in the chat. Let's see what is the question here. Jessica, yes, we'll send out a copy for this. And let's see, John. Well, yeah, it's a great question. So the use case, again, prior to getting the license, the use case that I talked about has to be, one that we know of, right? We don't want you testing it if it's a use case that we know we can't address yet, or it's still being worked on. And then that would just make no sense. But assuming all the testing goes well in your environment, then and you're ready to move forward, then it's just a matter of, hey, we'd like to expand this beyond. And so the production license would be changed out to a perpetual, basically unlimited, meaning it's attached to your workspace edition. That has to be under maintenance. If you don't renew your maintenance, that kind of turns some stuff off, or you can't upgrade, you can't do all those things, but the function still works. But that's how that is. I don't see any other questions, Seb.
No, that's it, basically. You're absolutely correct. We just had 2 questions in Q&A and 1 question from John in the chat. So you didn't miss something. I guess you covered everything. That's the reason why we didn't got questions.
Can I ask a live question here?
Yeah, please do.
Sure.
Chris, Is the appliance mode Pi Agent, is that going to go the way of the Dodo? Is this the new world, or is that going to continue to get developed?
That's an Imprivata answer. I think they are. I don't know how much more development they're going to do in terms of what's on their current roadmap. But it's obviously been around for a decade. It's still going to be there. We've been talking with them about the OS 12 side of things, and obviously we've gone through and shown them what we've built and that type of thing, and going through that official certification process with them. But we shall see. I think obviously we didn't want to be in a situation where customers that needed to be on 12 or wanted to be on 12 and we're an Imprivata shop didn't have an option. So that's kind of what drove our development of having a 12 app as well as an option for 11 based on the use cases that we were trying to address, and then net new use cases that are either on the roadmap or will emerge and become available. So
Excellent, thank you.
yeah, no worries. As the former product manager for Pi, I hope that was a diplomatic answer for you. That was part of my job there at one point when I was at Imprivata. Another live question, fire away.
Still have 5 minutes left, guys, so step up and mute yourself and ask whatever you like.
If we're wanting to fast track and implement and test a solution, what would be the best method of doing this?
Great question. So again, as I mentioned before, you can, we need to validate the use case, right? Based on what we currently have available. And so there is, let me put this into the chat. Give me 1 second. If you have your, if you know your IGEL team is, you can talk to them certainly. So let me see if this pastes into the chat. There we go.
Where are you based out of?
I think that was that Danny Foster speaking earlier?
Yes,
yep.
that was Danny Foster with Houston Methodist.
Yeah. So I know we've had some conversations with
Me and Trey, right?
Right, yeah. So for some reason this browser is not behaving correctly, but let me just put this up on the screen here. Monitor number 1. Okay. So that link will take you to this page. There's a form you basically fill out and check what you're interested in. And then what we'll do is get with you, kind of review the scenario. Is it something that, for example, we can address right now? Or is it one that is continuing to emerge based on customer interest or demand or whatever it might be? And we've got it on our roadmap. Or we want to get back with you and review the use case a little bit more deeply. So I've been on a lot of calls where we've gone a little bit more in depth into the specific use case to understand what they're trying to achieve. Often because they have access to the local desktop with the non-appliance mode solution and then driving it from there. But yeah, fill this form out. That comes into IGEL, and then we would get back with you to review the situation. And then once that use case is for sure, then that just opens up the opportunity to try and test your situation. Again, we have template profiles that you can just import into UMS, and then you've got your baseline in terms of here's the best practice for that specific use case or use cases. So don't try to reinvent the wheel and create something that you're like, hey guys, that's really not how you're supposed to do it. Use this, and that'll resolve for at least have that use case available.
Thank you, Chris. Right. Just in case, we just have 2 minutes left. Would you like to go through the last 3 questions we have in the Q&A before calling it an end?
Yep, I'll fire a quick fires. Yes, it does require the VDA license, John. That was part of our agreement with Imprivata. We checked for that. So if, in fact, if you were adding in a scenario where if the VDA license isn't in the appliance, first of all, you shouldn't have the license because it's a controlled scenario. But if you do have the license, we check for it. But if it's not there, we'll have an error message. But Let's see, if you have issues while testing, who would you reach out to? So certainly during the testing phase, we have working with the pre-sales, whatever like that, you can open up a support case, and we have a mechanism to flag the case with the IGEL agent for Imprivata. And then we've got the log files that you can attach, that type of thing. And then the template profiles, right now, we don't have them publicly available. That's really being provided by the IGEL resource that you would be working with initially. So,
Perfect.
So we are right on time.
On the minute. Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for everyone who was joining the session. We will share the session afterwards as usual. Renee is doing a great job in getting everything together, making the social media announcements around this, and we will share it on our non-channels like videos.igelcommunity.com and our YouTube channel. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Renee, for setting this up, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Take care.